brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village and Britain the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
I guess it's 7 o'clock, so we are going to go ahead and start. And this is our episode 33. We're still on Greco Persian wars. Now we're on the actual wars. I know that's been done to death, but I will try to cover at least some interesting moments of that very lengthy and very convoluted conflict between the two. The two powers, one of which was at its heights and the other one was up and coming, and oftentimes is considered to be the underdog and is the sympathetic party in that conflict. Shout out as always to Marwaen. I also would like to send a shout out to another podcaster whose maps I have used extensively in this episode, and that's War Game Rus Soldier. And it's a gentleman who collects miniatures and then does war type reconstructions with them. It's a pretty good war expert. So shout out to his podcast and YouTube channel. I will post the link under this episode. And I guess we're going to get started. So Greco Persian wars. How did all of that nonsense begin? Well, it began with our great king Darius in English, who, as we remember, Cyrus the Great ended his life fighting Scythians in the last glorious war, which he undertook into the far-off lands and tried basically with the intention to die in great glory, which he managed to succeed at. And so his eventual, maybe unintended heir, Darius, also undertook a campaign against the Scythians. And in order to achieve that, he decided to build a bridge. And at the time when they were marching in Scythia, Darius has, well, not Darius, even Cyrus originally has already conquered the nearby kingdom of Lydia. Okay, here's a map of the size of the Persian Empire under different rulers. So we can see that under Cyrus it grew, under his son it grew some more, and at that time they conquered Egypt, and then under Darius it expanded further. Yeah, and where David is going around with the magnifying glass, that's the Scythian territory. So at that point in time, let me pull up my maps now. This is more or less our Persian Empire at that time. Persia, roughly around the year 546 BC, of course, had defeated King Xerxes. Is that how you pronounce it in English? It's Kres in Russian, so I assume it's Xerxes in English, of Lydia. And before we get to our Scythian campaign, I guess I better tell the little tale about this infamous and famous king. I'm sure that many of you know this story, so if I'm repeating something that you already know, just bear with me. So Xerxes was extremely well-off king. He was very prosperous and very happy. So Lydia is right here. You can see right here actually on this map where Lydia was before it got attached to the Persian Empire. Xerxes, there's a tale about him that Greek wise man Solon was visiting his capital, and Xerxes, being very happy and very proud with his well-to-do situation and his awesome rule, asked this wise man. He said, well, who do you think is the happiest man alive? After showing him his treasures and his slaves and his wonderful lands and his beautiful palace. And Solon thought about it, and he said, I think the happiest men alive are these two brothers from back home in Greece. Their mother was a priestess of Hera, and one day she needed to go and attend a festival, and she was supposed to ride in her chariot to the festival of her goddess. And the horses, or in this case, the bulls that were supposed to be pulling the chariot, fell ill for whatever reason, and they were not able to transport her. And so her two sons, they took it upon themselves to pull the chariot all the way to the celebration. And so therefore their mother was able to make it to the celebration. in time. And she was so grateful to her sons that during this festival, when she was giving a prayer to her goddess, she asked her goddess that her sons be granted the greatest happiness possible, that they always will be remembered and that they will always be revered as they were that day for delivering their mother so selflessly to her important event. And of course, the goddess heard her priestess, and the two sons fell asleep the next day, and they never woke up, and therefore they died young at the peak of their fame and at the peak of their having done a good deed. And so that's who Solon originally said were rather the happiest man on earth. Well, Croesus, having heard that, scratched his head and he said, okay, that's all good. But who's the next happiest man out there in this world? And Solon said, well, and he named just an average citizen of one of the Greek city-states. And he said, this man, he lived an average life. He wasn't rich, he wasn't poor. He has not done many bad deeds. He had a family. He was good to his friends. He didn't have any debts. He was a decent citizen. He did everything right. And he died defending his home city. And so I think he's the happiest ever man on earth. And okay, said Croesus at this point in time, being quite annoyed. What about me? What do you think about me? I mean, look at me. I have all these riches. I have this wonderful country. I have all these servants. Am I not the happiest man on earth? And Solon looked at him and he said, well, you're not dead yet. It's kind of too early to tell. So I don't believe that a man's happiness can be judged until his life is over. And in that sense, he was absolutely right, because shortly thereafter, the Persian Empire started expanding nearby the kingdom of Lydia. And again, the legend has it that Croesus has sent to the oracle, to the Greek Delphi oracle, to inquire whether or not he should try to do war upon these newcomers to the region. And he received, as usual, oracles give a very fuzzy response, very veiled response. And the oracles responded was, well, if you begin this war, you shall defeat a great kingdom. And so Croesus thought that meant that he is going to be victorious. And so he undertook that particular campaign, and of course he lost quite rapidly. And he couldn't really complain to the oracle, because he did defeat, or rather lose, a great kingdom, and that was his own. But those are some of the legendary stories about Croesus. The bottom line is, with the taking of the Lydian territory, the Persians also acquired some of the Greek city-states that were located on that continent, or rather on that part of the continent, that were not mainland Greece, but were the Anatolian and basically the Greek colonies. And at first they had on and off, as anytime you have an empire that conquers smaller peoples, there's on and off rebellions, there's complex trading and tributary relationships. But the way that the Persians preferred to rule, they preferred to support the local tyrants in those city-states, because with a tyrant, you have a single person that you can request and demand your duties from, that you can demand your payouts from. And it's just much more convenient way to govern a territory. Mongols, much later on, when they conquer the Kiev Rus kingdom, they're going to be ruling by the same kind of method. Greco-Persian wars, they have been done to death pretty much, because it is such a defining moment for modern day democratic societies and really for modern day Western society, that I think that glorification of that moment in history, which stretched out for quite a long period of time. If I'm correct, I mean, it was, I just want to double check my dates, but it was over, I think, 40 years, if not longer. Which is really, from the point of view of history, is a rather short period of time. That has impacted democracy and Western society immensely. And because most of the sources that we have been exposed to as members of the Western culture, whether it is United States or Russia or various European countries and peoples, it has been so Greco-centric, with almost no Persian perspective on the events. And even what we perceive oftentimes is the Persian perspective, which is, for example, the famous play, tragedy, rather, The Persians, was also written by Greeks on behalf of the Persians, presenting the Persian point of view in such a way that is most advantageous to the Greek society, to the Greek mindset, and in the end of it all, to the Greek sense of self-worth. I think that I'm going to just kind of shoot out the spoiler right here, in case anybody didn't know. The Greeks won, the Persians lost. But I'm sure that everybody here has seen the movie 300, which is a lovely comic and a very well filmed production, but is an abomination when it comes to what they did to history. That just like, for example, the movie Genviel is an abomination as to what, or rather the movie Beowulf is an abomination as to what they have done to that famous Anglo-Saxon poem. We know that certain events served as precursors to the actual conflict between the Persian Empire and the Greek city-states. I mean, before that, we know there was a campaign. Oh, there's our expert. That there was a campaign undertaken against the Scythians by the Persians. As a result of that campaign, the Scythians had, not the Scythians, well, the Scythians had played a lot of hide and seek with Persians and kind of really irritated them. The Persians co-opted Greeks in their anti-Scythian campaign quite successfully. When Persian Empire was expanding, it took up basically within it a lot of the Greek city-states that were located on the territories that the Persian Empire was gradually encroaching upon and taking over. So this is a fairly good map, just kind of covering the terrain at the time of everything that occurred. So Persia was expanding, and as we talked, in our last little cutoff episode, as they expanded, they took over various neighboring states. They took, of course, over Babylon fairly early on. They took over Lydia and made it one of their satrapies, which is what the Persians called kind of a province. They took over a lot of the Ionic city-states that were Greek ethnically and incorporated them into their empire as part of their campaign against the Scythians and just general exploration of the surrounding area. What they managed to do is also take Thrace and Macedonia under their control. And so the Persian Empire had quite a few ethnic Greeks who were a part of their imperial peoples. Now, we know that when you are an empire, and I think I've mentioned that before, the big difference between an empire and a state is that an empire typically incorporates many different ethnicities, many different cultures, many different ways of lives, religions, and so languages, and so forth. And so historically, a lot of the empires, not all of them, some empires have been extremely brutal in suppressing these, but generally an empire does allow a level of, not necessarily independence, but some level of originality and kind of preservation of its original ethnic, cultural, and historical behaviors, traditions, and sometimes even aristocratic families remain in place and continue to rule. And that is what the Persians did whenever they conquered different regions. They were fairly open about allowing the peoples under their control to practice their own form of religion, to continue with their own customs, to conduct their own affairs in the way that they preferred to, unless, of course, those peoples rebelled, in which case any empire usually cracks down pretty heavily. So again, the same kind of a map, and actually this is a good map because it shows you kind of who and where was part of Persia. So if we see right here in the orange, we have Persian Empire, and all of these areas were encompassed by Persia. Now I'm trying to find Naxos. So everything began with this little island of Naxos. Naxos was at the time of the beginning of the Ionian revolt, was under its own rule of its own aristocratic class. And the people at Naxos decided to kick their aristocrats out and establish something akin to democracy. Those aristocrats went running to basically a state that was already under Persian control and Persian patronage, or rather city-state, and that was Miletus. And that was a Greek city-state, and it was one of the, it's right here, it was one of the greatest Greek city-states in that area of the world. It was one of the wealthiest trading city-states, and it was ruled by a tyrant who was approved and appointed, well, not necessarily appointed, but at the very least approved by the Persians, and that was Aristogoras. And of course, at the same time in that region, in the same city, also they had an appointed Persian ruler, bureaucrat, or governor, for lack of a better term, that was named according to some sources. And we will come back to this name because this is a conspiracy theory that I'm not going to throw out there until the end of the story. But anyway, but then just remember this name as Artaxvarna, and it's a Persian name. Just remember that this was the name of satrap, which is basically the governor of Miletus. Well, the aristocrats from Naxos ran away to Miletus, and they ran to the tyrant of Miletus, whose name was Aristogoras. And they said, we want to get back in power on our home island, help us regain our rule in this territory. And Aristogoras thought that was a great idea. So he was able to talk to the local Persian representative, Artaxerxes, I believe was his name, who in return went and discussed this matter with the Persian ruler, who at the time was Darius, and got the approval of the Persian state to actually send ships and do an invasion of the island, which was not a very big island, but the Persians kind of got excited about the idea of annexing these additional territories, because the way that this was sold to them by the Greek tyrant, Aristogoras, was that this could be used then as a launching point to take over the rest of the mainland Greece and some of the other islands in the Aegean Sea. Well, because this idea belonged to Aristogoras, and because he kind of figured out all the logistics, he was basically assigned to be the head of this invading force. Someone in the Persian commanding, probably Persian command, somebody in the Persian army high up was not very pleased with this decision. He did not think that a foreigner should be leading a Persian invasion force. And so it is rumored that the people on the island of Naxos had been forewarned about the invasion. They had a chance to prepare against it, and they were able to fight the Persians off, which in return made Aristogoras, the tyrant of Miletus, look rather bad in front of the rulers of Persia, because this was his enterprise, his proposition, his expedition, and he had failed miserably, or at least it appeared that he had failed, even though he had been in fact undermined by what was more or less essentially an act of treason by one of the Persians. And when Aristogoras realized that he's likely to face the wrath of the Persian elite, he decided to handle the matters by raising a revolt in his own city. He stepped down as the tyrant of the city and put out a call to all the Ionian states, all these little city-states that are Greek city-states that were part of the Persian Empire and had been for a while, to rise up and overthrow the Persian rule. And the people in the city were so thrilled by the fact that here is a tyrant who voluntarily wanted to step down from his ruling place, that they supported him. Moreover, they elected him as the official head of the rebellion. So he didn't really lose much of anything by doing the stepping down from his position. And the city-states around him also rose up, and a lot of them rose up. Some were reluctant, but a lot of them did rise up. Moreover, what he did, he sent messengers, he sent envoys to various Greek mainland city-states and polises, asking them for their aid in their glorious uprising against the evil Persian oppressors. And a lot of the city-states refused. Sparta, for example, was originally, when the messenger from Aristogoras arrived to Sparta and tried to talk the Spartan leadership into the idea of participating in this rebellion. The Spartans, originally being Spartans and liking anything that's manly and warlike, kind of were considering it. But then one of the kings asked the messenger, well, how far is the capital of the Persian Empire from your city, from Miletus? And when he found out that they were talking about 2 to 3 months journey, the Spartan said, oh, no, that's not our kind of war. That's kind of too far away. Not our thing. No, thank you. At which point in time, Aristogoras tried to bribe the Spartan elite. And the Spartans, to their honor and to their credit, pretty much turned down the bribe and refused to participate in this crazy undertaking. But 2 city-states on semi-main Greek land did participate. And those were Athens, and it was Eretria. Now, Eretria was a fairly small city-state. Athens sent 20 ships. Eretria sent even less than that. They'd send even fewer ships. Bottom line is, they joined the big battle against the evil Persian oppressors. And long story short, the Persians called them the Phoenicians, which was their basically sea branch, their fleet. And in a decisive battle, the Ionian city-states in their rebellion. First, the fleet was defeated, and then the city-states themselves, the actual mainland rebellion, was quenched. And all would have been well in the land of Persia, because this was not a really big deal within the Persian Empire, which you can see we're just looking at a little corner of, right? Because, I mean, this is just, if we look at the size of this territory versus the rest of territory of Persia, really, just some small rebellion somewhere on the outskirts of their land. And they had rebellions all the time. All would have been fantastic and great if during their rebellion for the first little while, the Ionians originally were successful in their land rebellion. But nobody in Persia expected this crazy attack from more or less loyal city-states. And in their first initial thrust, they managed to overtake the capital, the local capital, which used to be the capital of Lydia, but now was basically the capital of the Persian province. And that was the city of Sardos. And they were not able to take the citadel, so they took the lower city, but the actual Persian forces that were stationed in that city, which were completely unprepared for the sudden backstab attack, they managed to lock themselves up in the citadel, and so the Greeks set fire to the lower city. According to the accounts, for example, by Herodotus and some other references, that was not intended, but regardless of whether it was intended or not, couple of very important, very old, and very revered temples went down in those flames. So, fast forward, when the revolt got quenched, revolt is one thing. Desecrating temples is a whole separate story. We know that Persians have been kind of suspicious of the Greeks to begin. I mean, the Greeks were basically the people who maybe potentially were Devas worshippers. Remember that whole thing? Because Zeus and sacrificing cows, and that's kind of not very cool, and they eat beef and suspicious kind of folks. Well, once the burning down of the temples commenced, the Persian elite decided that these were definitely, absolutely evil Devas worshippers. And so when the city of Miletus was taken, that city was completely just torn to the ground, and every person, man, woman, and child in that city got sold into slavery or killed. Persians were trying to teach everybody a very serious lesson, and because that city was at the center of the attack, the Persians were very much intent on making sure that that does not get repeated. This shocked the Greek world on both sides of the Aegean Sea, because that city was a very famous, very wealthy, and a very prominent city in the Greek world. That shock of that loss reflected in literature, Greek literature. It is something that just really scared and shook up a lot of Greeks to the very bottom of their hearts. Well, so the Miletus was taken in 494, and the Persians now realized that somewhere on the other side of the Aegean existed these weird states, something like Athens and something like Eretria, who were meddling in their internal state affairs. These strange unknown entities that Persians really didn't pay much attention to, because what do Persians want in Greece, really? I mean, Persians like to have their chariots, they like to have their wide open spaces, and Greece is not very good for chariots. I mean, if it's good for anything, it's not that. But now, the Greeks were aware that not only were these foreign powers meddling into internal Persian political affairs, that they sent military aid to the rebels. And never mind that the aid was really minuscule. And never mind that once Athens realized that they were on the losing side, they kind of quickly retreated their support. What was done was done. The great machine of the enormous empire has turned its head towards this little region that we know as Greece. I'm going to stop for a second and see if anybody has anything to add.
Couple interesting points. When they sacked Sardis, Persian satrap Arthanes, which we'll hear more about probably his son, was in the citadel. They were kind of way punching over their weight with this whole rebellion. And probably wasn't the brightest thing to do in the world.
Not particularly. And, and I just want to kind of point out the role of individual in history, because in this case, the whole thing was truly initiated by one individual who was trying to save his butt from a kind of an intrigue, a political intrigue that he himself initiated in hope of gaining personal wealth, would be my suspicion. I mean, I didn't meet the man personally, but my suspicion, judging by his actions, and considering that he tried to bribe in allies, probably wasn't the man of the highest character, and not exactly what you would call a patriot. Somebody who just initiated a Persian invasion against another Greek city-state. and then tries to be the leader of the anti-Persian rebellion the moment that he feels his own behind on fire.
One other point there, Miletus was actually, they cut their own throat commercially, big time. They were the center of the Ionian, Persian, they were the favored city, if you will, commercially. And that wouldn't be the case after this.
Right, and as we talked in one of the previous episodes, this is when we were talking about the story of Artemisia and the whole rise of her city. I mean, that particular collapse of Miletus is what allowed the other city-state to become more prominent. What the Persians did is what imperial powers often do. They punished horrifically the perpetrators, what they considered to be the perpetrators of the uprising, but they were rather indulgent with all the other participants. So Darius had appointed one of his very brilliant commanders, Mardonius, to deal with this whole Greek situation, because the fact that Athens and Eretria meddled in their affairs was not something that a large empire could tolerate or put up with. So Mardonius was supposed to handle the Ionian city-states, deal with Greeks, all the Greeks, go do something with these Greeks. So Mardonius did, first of all, he did a very surprising to us thing, but actually a very logical thing for the Persians. He basically removed all the tyrants and all of the Persian city-states that were under Persian control, that no longer wanted to be under tyranny, and allowed for democracy, which basically on the one hand they whipped was the one hand, and with the other hand they kind of offered cookies and carrots. So it was kind of the policy of stick and carrot, really, and the Persians were really good at that. So then he undertook the Persian fleet, and every time I say the Persian fleet, you got to remember we're talking about the Phoenician fleet, because again, a thing to remember for future discussions on the subject, Persians cannot swim, okay? Persians by definition are incapable of swimming. They do not live on the sea. They don't like the sea. So anytime we're talking about the Persian fleet, we're not talking about the Persian fleet. It's one or another. It's either Persian Greeks, or Greeks who are on the Persian side, or it's most like the Phoenicians. So the Persian fleet decided to undertake a journey to punish these not very nice city-states. And the Persian fleet followed the shorelines, south coast of Anatolia. So here is where Mardonius journeyed against the Greeks originally with his first expedition. What Mardonius did is he went up hugging kind of the shoreline, and at one point in time, the fleet, the large Persian fleet, was the Persians who were unable to swim. They encountered a major storm, lost a lot of people. And at that point in time, Mardonius decided that maybe that was not such a good idea to do this sea expedition. They decided to back up and redo this at a later time by different route. Because here's the thing, Persians are a land-based military force. And when you load tons of your land-based work, because these were not the war, these are not Romans yet, right? Romans, since they were not any good at fighting on the sea, they learned this whole weird tactic of basically attaching their ships to the enemy ships and turning them into land in the sea and then fighting as if they were on land. Well, the Persians haven't gotten that far. They were basically using these as transport ships. And so when a storm hit, and according to Herodotus, up to 300 ships of the Persian fleet went down, and they lost a lot of people. Again, I don't know how much the numbers offered by Herodotus, who is very exact and very interesting with his numeration of enemy forces. But according to him, around 20,000 warriors were lost. So that was enough of a blow to cut the expedition short. And the land army at the same time was fighting Thracians and Macedonia, which rose up in revolt along with the Ionian states, and Persians were able to recapture those territories fairly easily. So bottom line, the lesson that the Persians got from this whole encounter is that A, the sea is not our friend, and B, that because of the Macedonian thing, which Macedonia at this point in time, you've got to understand that it was so different from the rest of the Greece. Macedonians were the last arrivals. They were kind of the barbarians of the Greek world. Most Greeks didn't consider Macedonians to be Greeks. They were quite far behind in their development. And the Persian military machine did not have much trouble with the Macedonia. And that's pretty much the image they had of the Greeks at this point in time. I mean, they had the Ionian city-states, which they were able to pop, one after another. And they had the Macedonians, which again, were just very kind of low-level development barbarians in their eyes. So the Persians really figured out that the whole issue was that they took the wrong route, but they did need to do something about these meddling states of Athens and I cannot pronounce it again. Darn it. Eritrea. So they relaunched a new campaign shortly. But before they did that, they went ahead and sent out diplomats to all Greek city-states asking whether or not they wanted to fight or they just wanted to basically step down and accept Persian protectorate, Persian rule. A lot of the city-states faced with this machine, an enormous machine of the Persian military, agreed to surrender basically. And they were given fairly decent, Persians were really good at giving rather generous terms to those who willingly joined them. However, two cities, Sparta and Athens, which by the way, prior to all of this have been at each other's throat, as Sparta and Athens have done throughout their history, both refused, and both of them made the tragic mistake, later much repeated by anybody who dealt with the Mongolian ambassadors. People, you don't ever kill the ambassador, okay? Killing the ambassador is bad idea. People tend to get very, very mad if you kill the ambassador, even if that ambassador is in fact also a spy, which most diplomats typically serve both functions, in case anybody didn't know. But even if you know that that diplomat is in fact also a spy, don't throw them down the well, okay? And you don't hold a trial and execute diplomats who are basically messengers. Bad things happen to you if you do that. Well, both Sparta and Athens did this. Now, I understand why Athens did this, because Athens already was elbows deep in the whole conflict and knew that Persians were coming regardless. I'm a little bit at a loss, honestly, and I haven't been able to figure out. I'm open to suggestions as to what purpose did this action serve Sparta. I mean, either they were just stupid and they really didn't want, and well, we all know Sparta was not the greatest diplomats on the planet. I mean, they couldn't even rule a conquered territory when they tried. They could do it only by force and fire. But why did Sparta jump into this conflict, which originally they really had nothing to do with, is to me, to this day, is a mystery. Any suggestions? I mean, other than just basic realization that, look, we're next door neighbors, we're probably going to get conquered too.
Maybe they just really didn't like the Persians.
I know Sparta liked Persians. They did quite a bit of dealings with the Persians throughout. And later on, they were quite friendly with the Persians and did a lot of interactions with them, quite frankly.
It has me thinking, there's a lot of political and personal intrigue in the story. But as with a lot of conflict, there's usually a lot of money involved. And so I'm wondering if there's a component of, follow the money that's been somehow, perhaps lost to history.
That would be valid, and I would totally agree with that opinion, except we got to remember what the Spartans considered to be money and what their money looked like. Remember the big iron rods that you had to carry around that nobody else wanted because they had no value? That was the Spartan idea of money at that time anyhow. So I'm not sure that, I think with Sparta it was really more just, fronting, kind of like we're the Spartans, we don't surrender. Who the heck do you think you?
I would conjecture it was about relations within the Greek world as a whole. They couldn't afford to let Athens be the champion leader of this revolt of this conflict if it was, and self-preservation too, right? In a sense, they could have given what the Persians asked for, a token of land and water.
Right. And probably never speak Persians again.
Right. But at the same time, their status would be somewhat diminished. And, they like to think of themselves as the first Greek city. So.
Yeah, true that.
So. I agree with that. I think it had to do with their position as the elite warriors, and they were getting shown up because the Athenians were willing to step up, and they initially weren't. So they were being shown up among their Greek counterparts, and they couldn't have that. So I think what David said was accurate, that they're standing in their face. They had lost face because they weren't as brave as the other ones who were willing to stand up to the Persians. And even though I don't think it was a matter of cowardice, I think it was a matter of indifference or just tactical strategy as to why they didn't initially stand up. I think they realized that, well, shit, if the Athenians are going to do it, we got to do it.
Right, and I think that makes sense because there was a lot of competition for leadership in the Greek world between those two throughout, and it will continue for a long time.
And right in this situation is that conflicts all blended into the 50 years of the initial revolt and all that.
Well, and plus, I mean, you know, Spartans were not, again, the greatest diplomats and they're not the greatest, probably, strategists in the world. But I think that they understood the fact that the moment you have a giant empire next door to you, you're just the next thing they're going to take. I mean, that's just a given. So another interesting thing took place during this whole time. As we know, recently, some of the Greek city-states, particularly Athens, has kicked out their own aristocracy and their own ruling class, and also their lovely tyrant dynasty. Well, the last of the Athenian tyrants. The old, by this point in time, Hippias, and whatever was left of the immigrant Athenian aristocracy has flocked to the Persian court. A lot of them flocked there to begin with because obviously they couldn't go home, and we remember that being a non-citizen in the Greek city-states was pretty much being nobody. And since they got thrown out of Athens, they weren't exactly welcome anywhere else in any of the other Greek city-states. So a lot of them landed as a result in Persia. And now they were either found or themselves voluntarily. In case of Hippias, I suspect very much that he voluntarily flocked to the court of Darius as the personal advisor and an expert on how do we take Athens. Because he was hoping to come back and maybe rule for a little bit longer, on his own rightful throne, so to speak, on that wave of Persian invasion. We got to remember that about the same time in Italy, very similar thing was happening with the last of the kings thrown out of Rome who were attempting to come back and reconquer Roman city at that time. The idea of patriotism such was very strange in those times. I mean, it's a very nationalism, patriotism, national pride is a very modern idea. It's really very extremely modern idea. The Greeks at the time, they were loyal to their little city-states, which were really tiny. I mean, Athens and Sparta being some of the largest ones, a couple other ones, but they didn't really think of themselves as Greeks, and the logical thinking, as it is explained in the sources of the aristocrats and of the Hippias, and actually of people throughout times who get kicked in the rear by the big, heavy, steel-toed boot of their beloved homeland, oftentimes as well. If you're going to treat me like that, I'm going to treat you like that back, and that unfortunately happens quite often. So, Persians decided to repeat the invasion. 2 years later, they take a different route. They go directly over the islands. In the process of all this, they take and totally destroy the little city-state of Eretria. And they land, at the advice of Hippias himself, they land in what is known as the Marathon location. And I'm going to pull up those maps because now we're going to go into the stuff that I was hoping for some feedback from experts here.
Can I make a point while you do that?
Go right ahead while I'm looking for stuff, please.
Okay.
By all means.
I think it's very interesting that the Persians played this whole idea of democracy versus the aristocrats, the nobility, if you will, against each other in their settling of the rebellion.
I think you have a point there, but this is the modern view of the Marathon location. And so there's a couple of things about how this battle went down. Now, when the Persian army landed in Marathon, I'm going to give you a couple of versions of how this all went down. And then I'm going to give you a comical version of the entire encounter, which I think is hysterical. But when the Athenians realized that this enormous force is coming upon them, they did send a messenger to Sparta for help. And the Spartans at that time, and the Spartans did not say we're not going to come, no. What's recorded is the Spartans said, look, we are in the middle of a very important religious holiday right now that absolutely prohibits us from waging war. We will be there, but we can't make it there the next few days. So what happened is basically the Athenians realized that they were one-on-one with this threat and they had no choice but to face it on their own. One of the advisors to the Athenian military was somebody who has personally fought with the Persians against the Scythians in the previous Persian anti-Scythian campaign. I want to say it was Miltiades. Yeah, Miltiades. I knew that. I just kind of started questioning myself. Anyhow, so he was one of the people who was advising the military decisions made by the Athenians, and they had one ally, and that was the Plataeans, who came to their aid. It was only 1,000 soldiers. The other person, the man who was originally the commander of the Athenian army, and who also was very deeply involved in this entire enterprise, his name was Callimachus, and this is a name we want to remember because he is kind of a symbol all of his own. He's also an important marker that was later used to try to recreate the actual physical battlefield. The Persians were under the command of Datis, who was their commander.
Who was the Persian commander? I missed that.
Datis. His name was Darius. So let me pull up the hand-drawn maps, which I need to say that I took these maps specifically from War Game Roost Soldier podcast, which is actually a podcast about tactical games like video games. But these maps were really good, and I wanted to use them. So let me go ahead and share that screen. And I want to at least begin on the Battle of Marathon before we get. So this is our setup right here, okay? If you look at it, I mean, this is a black and white sea. So most likely, so here's our marathon, right? Here's our, and I had to write over a Russian map in an English language. Here's Thebes, here's Plataeus. So the Athenians, they sent for help to the Plataeans. They also sent to help to the Spartans, but the Spartans didn't come. So what we have here is there's our marathon, there's our, sea. The likely route which the Athenians took to Marathon is marked right here, okay? The likely route that the Plataeans took to the Marathon location is right here. And of course, we know that the Persian army arrived from the side of the sea. So here's the area where this battle took place, and I want to kind of go in details over this battle. And this is again Russian map written over in English. The thing is the way that things were set up and the way that the records are pulled up. There's a mention that the Athenians camped by or even within the sacred grove of Hercules. This would have been the only area that covered by trees in that particular layout. There's your bay. Right here was a swamp. And that's again comes back, I will come back to what the memorial is. Now, where the Persians were camped right here, this is where Persian fleet likely landed, was also, there's the beach and there was a swamp or lake here. Bottom line is not very passable area. But here's the thing, up here, and you can, it's cutting it off, but there was a spring of some sort of a sacred source of fresh water, bottom line is. And it is highly likely that when they originally landed, the Persians sent their cavalry over there because it was a source of fresh water. It's something that they desperately needed help, that they desperately needed to have access to now. So this is the idea of how the armies were likely stationed before the actual battle took place. The Athenians most likely were within the, and this is one of the potential reconstructions. There are different ones because originally, traditionally, the idea was that the Persians were actually lined up along the shore and the Athenians were coming from over here. So it was parallel to the actual shoreline. The modern reconstruction, the latest one, that one that I kind of lean towards, is the one that says it was a diagonal lineup. And the reason for that is this memorial, which we will come back to. So right here I have, Makarios Spring right here is most likely where the Persian cavalry was stationed. And the rest of the Persian forces were on the ground right here, and the fleet was still basically in the thing. Athenians hid among the trees, which was a good idea because they were very much concerned. Of course, them being infantry soldiers, they were very much concerned at being attacked by the heavy Persian cavalry, because Persians had both the heavy and the lighter cavalry, and they had the more elite heavy infantry as well as lighter infantry. This is the reconstruction of the battlefield, and I'm going to explain to you. It's the same exact map we have just been looking at. What the Greeks were very much concerned about is that the Greeks had new bows. Of course, they've used bows and arrows, but that was not something that they liked to use very much. They were worried about attacking on foot against archers and being taken out. They were also very concerned about what the cavalry is going to do to their ranks. They have not had terribly many encounters with heavy cavalry at this point in time. And so for quite a few days, what happened is the Persians sat in their camp and the Athenians continued to sit in their camp. And the one Athenian leader, the one who had previously fought with the Persians, who knew Persian tactics, whose name was Miltiades. He strongly advised to not sit and wait. He strongly advised to go ahead and attack. And the Persians, in their position, felt fairly confident. And I really do think they underestimated the Greeks because, as I said earlier, they have had more or less kind of not a very difficult conquest of other Greek territories, especially of the little islands and especially of the Macedonian peoples who were not nearly at the level of development of the Athenians militarily or organizationally. And so I don't think that they were quite aware of what they were going to go up against. This is my guess. This right here is a valid reconstruction. What I'm saying about the mental states of different armies is not necessarily accurate. Anyway, at some point in time, a couple of days into the standoff, somehow it became known to the Greek commanders that the Persian cavalry has departed. It is still debated why and where and for what reason the Persian cavalry, the heavy cavalry, why and where they went away. It is debated that it is possible that the cavalry that the overcommander, the main commander of the entire force, decided to take the cavalry around and attack Athens while the Athenian army was engaged elsewhere, because Athens was left exposed at this point in time. And because there's some indication that when the ships departed with the cavalry loaded up onto it, that instead of heading directly for Athens, they actually went the opposite direction and kind of took a roundabout round. But at least that was the plan. What happened at this point in time, as soon as the word came that the cavalry was gone, the Greeks had decided to attack. And there's, by the way, still a saying to this day in Greece that means now is the time to act, and that is the saying, the cavalry is gone. It's, to this day, it's just part of the Greek language. It's that deeply embedded. Does anybody want to jump in and say anything?
Just thinking about the strategics here.
Which map do you want me to pull back?
Oh, the one, you're fine. Just the idea that, one, the Athenians had been, according to Herodotus, I believe, it was in the Athenians' interest to wait and for Sparta to get there.
Right.
And so they would have been positioned to block the easiest route straight to Athens.
Right.
And just wait. When the cavalry was loaded on the ships, it forced their hand.
Right.
They had to act because, one, not only did they have to race back to get Athens, they didn't need them in their rear.
Right.
As they faced the infantry.
That's a good point.
So I'm not sure. I don't know if this is the best route to Athens.
Well, and I will explain to you why this reconstruction has shifted in the recent years. This memorial right here, it's kind of an important point, because there are records in classical Greek literature that at the place where the fighting was the fiercest, where some of the Greek heroes fell, actually a memorial had been constructed to honor the fallen, the Greek dead. And the place of that memorial, the archaeologists were able to recreate the place of that memorial, and the memorial is right here. And it was the Greek tradition that memorial is built exactly where the heroes being honored by have been killed, which means that at the time of the attack, this is where Greeks would have been, which makes not a lot of sense. It makes no sense for the people who had died in the battle to be right here, because if we would have had a parallel alignment, this person would have been right here.
Thinking why the cavalry would have been taken away, there's a lot of swamp there, and
well, here's the funny version.
Cavalry, especially heavy cavalry, don't work in swamps, so they would have been withdrawn.
Probably, and plus they needed fresh water. They frankly really needed fresh water, which is why they were forced to put them right here, because the horses need a lot of liquid. So the funny version is this: that the Persians, thinking that they're fairly, it's going to be basically a walk in the park. And again, this is my comic, not even Hollywood. This is like, I don't know, South Park version. Okay, so the Persians arrive to the Greek shore and the like. And they, by the way, they bring with him, of course, the old Athenian tyrant, Hippias, who is very excited to take over Athens again. There's a little legend that comes with it that I think everybody knows about, the prophecy that was given that his bones were going to lie back in the Athenian land, and how his tooth fell out. And when his tooth fell out, he cried and said, "Oops, I don't think I'm going to be buried here. I think my bones are already lying on my homeland." But anyway, they arrived with Hippias, and they looked around. And Hippias promised them that they're going to have local support, because he still had quite a few supporters in that particular area, which is why one of the reasons they picked the Marathon Bay among many others. And they looked around and they saw the Athenian army hanging out over in the trees, and they went, "We just fought those Macedonians. We just overcame all these stupid islands. It's going to be a breeze, walk in the park." So they unloaded their hot tubs and their dancers and their haoma, and got in their hot tubs with their dancers and started smoking a little haoma and just kind of chilling out, and were kind of caught completely off guard when the Greeks came running at them. That's the funny version. But I do think there's some truth to it, because I think that Persians had severely underestimated their enemies there. Because what the Athenians decided to do, as soon as they knew that the biggest threat, that the cavalry, was gone, they came up with a brilliant plan. It works. Of course, it's overlapping people. So you stand, your shield covers the person next to you, and the most dangerous and the most important, most crucial position within that line is the position of the last warrior, because that last warrior doesn't have a next warrior to cover him up with the shield. Am I making sense? And that's always the position that's taken by the actual commander of the army at those times in the Greek fighting alignment. So in this case, it would have been Callimachus, who was the commander of the Greek land army. So normally at that time, the way the Greeks built their, I'm not going to say the word I can't pronounce. Phalanx, thank you. The way they built it was 8 lines in deep. So that way you could switch. And the importance of holding that formation and how it worked is everybody had to be in unison. You didn't have to be a great, outstanding warrior. The main thing was not to step forward and not to fall back, because the moment you pull back, you open up a gap. The moment you step forward, you open up a gap and expose your comrades to either side of you, to the thrust, to the attack from the enemy. So you had to always keep in line. The entire line had to advance together. And the lines were formed in such a way that the exhausted front lines could pull back and the other lines could come forward. So usually the Greeks at that time lined up in a very specific way. They lined up in 8-line formation. Well, for some reason, in this case, and it's still debated why this was done. That's never been done before or since in Greek tactical situations. They lined up because they had those Plataeans, the southern Plataeans who came to assist them. They put them on the very flanks, and then they only put 4 lines in the center, and they put 8 lines around the edges. Whether that was done intentionally or whether that was an accidental decision, I strongly suspect that the Greeks did that quite intentionally, and that they had some sort of a plan in mind. But the biggest concern that the Greek commanders had really were the archers, because yes, shields are somewhat helpful, but there were a lot of archers. Especially the light infantry, of Persians who were very formidable and were very good at shooting. So the Greeks decided to do something again that never has been tried before, because usually when that line advances, they don't walk. You have to be in line. You have to keep in step, and so it's very slow. Step, 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 step. It's almost turtle pace, to the sound of flutes, to the sound of, they usually would be singing a song to keep each other in step. It would be very step, slow. And of course, if you're advancing on enemy archers in that kind of formation, you're pretty much a sitting duck. And that's something that the Greeks were very concerned about. So they most likely made an arrangement prior to their advance. They knew about how far the arrows could go, and they decided to, and they couldn't advance any faster than that, because the moment you start going faster, you break the ranks and you open up and you become a target. So then they had made an arrangement to issue somehow a command to the entire line to break into a run once they came exactly within the shooting range of the arrows, which is exactly what happened. And that's something the Persians absolutely did not expect from that. So the Persians were more or less chilling there with their bows drawn and waiting for these guys to come closer. Come on, a couple more steps, we're going to take you out. What they didn't expect is right at the last moment for the Greeks to break into a run. And the Persian elite, according to some reconstructions, their elite heavy infantry was lined up in the center, with the light archers being around the edges. And they pushed back when they saw the Greeks running at them. They pushed back and they broke through that thin center. They broke behind the Greek ranks. while the Greek thicker, side units, they came and at the archers quicker than the archers could actually shoot. The problem for the Persians was that the light archers didn't have shields, and they really didn't have much to fight with. You can't really hit a well-armored Greek upon the head with your bow. It's not going to be very effective. So the elite troops, the cream of the crop, basically, of the Persian army wound up being cut off from the main Greek lines and cut off right next to the swamp. They got pushed off to the side of the swamp to where the light infantry and the archers got overrun by the very heavy Greek hoplites. And that's where I think that Persians were really unprepared for the level of development of Greek military armor, or their armor, their strategy, their tactics, their overall fighting style was something that was more or less new, because they did encounter the city-states before, but Athens was much larger and much more advanced. I think Athens and Sparta both, they were quite at the lead of that particular progress. I mean, because Miletus, which has rebelled earlier, was really more of a trading city. It wasn't so focused on warfare or expansionism. Bottom line is, what happened is that the Greeks almost made it through they slaughtered those lightly armored archers, cut off the elite and chased them off into the swamps where the Persians, who we remember Persians can swim, drowned more or less. And so the best of the army was already gone, of the Persian army. The rest of it was in panic. The cavalry was nowhere near. There are moments in this particular battle to this day that make no sense to me, and I want to talk about it much later on. Why? Because Persians were not known for running on a battlefield. But there are two battles with the Greeks when Persians more or less had overwhelming numbers, or close to overwhelming numbers, when Persians broke their ranks and ran. And this is very strange to me, and I think there might have been more to that particular situation psychologically than just what's obvious to us, the basic layout of the troops on the field. But whatever the reason was, the Persians panicked, the ones who were still close to the ships, and they started trying to get back on their ships and get the heck out of there. A lot of the ships at that time were still beached. So what the Greeks started doing is they started going for the ships, slaughtering the Persians and trying to prevent the ships from departing. What ensued was more or less a slaughter. Now, Herodotus, whom we can trust so very much with his numbers, I really like Herodotus. I actually personally think he's a very accurate historian, but his numbers are a little bit fantastical, to say the least. He claims that as a result of this entire encounter, the Persians lost some ridiculous number of thousands of people, and the Greeks lost a couple hundred. Now, Persians were soundly defeated at this point in time. Whatever was left of them jumped onto the ships and departed. And the Persians raced to cut off the Athenian army forces from Athens themselves, because they figured, okay, we lost here, but if we jump on our ships, go around, we are on the sea and they are on foot and they're heavily armored and they just got done with the battle, so we're for sure going to beat them there.
Yeah, that's actually quite possible. If an army is routed, they're absolutely defenseless, and a small force that routs a bigger one can really do a lot of damage. Like thousands of people can die. That's absolutely how possible.
Absolutely.
Particularly in ancient warfare, because almost all your casualties, even today, are when people start fleeing and turning their backs and panicking and all of that, it becomes a slaughter.
Absolutely. And especially, and I think the problem was, and I think that's why I think that particular layout, rather than having Persians parallel to the shore, it makes better sense, because they were kind of pinned in that corner. They really didn't have anywhere to go. They either had the swamp to one side, the sea to the other side, and really the ships and nothing else, nowhere else to back up to. But bottom line is the Persians decided that they were going to go and beat the Athenians to Athens and just take the main cities, let them stay over there. Athenians, realizing that, did something that was really heroic and amazing deed, because you got to understand, I mean, that armor they were wearing was not light. It was not comfortable. And Greece is not a cool place. The climate in Greece is not conducive to air conditioning effects. Well, the Greeks managed to line up and run, walk and run and walk. And after a battle, lengthy battle, which you got to understand the way that these attacks went. I mean, the Greeks would go at the Persians, then would have to pull back and take a breather. It's heavy armor. It's hard to continuously, actively move in those kind of heavy work with that kind of equipment and those kinds of conditions. It's just physiologically you're going to get exhausted. Well, that army managed to beat the Persian fleet to Athens. And so when the Persians arrived near Athens, what they saw was a line of the Athenian army cutting them off from the city, at which time the Persians said, okay, all right, cool, we'll let you have the battlefield for now. And they pulled back. Couple interesting things that happened at that whole situation. The very underrated and quite amazing Athenian commander, Callimachus, and his his best friend, his second in command, both got severely wounded in the fight. But they knew that if the Greek forces saw that their commander has been slayed, that would affect the morale of the troops. What they did is they pretty much impaled themselves on spears because they already knew they were already bleeding out, and propped themselves standing up. So throughout the battle, it seemed to the rest of the troops that their commander was still there, was still vertical, was still alive. That's one of the fairly touching and fairly unique. Whether or not if it's a fairy tale, I don't know, but I don't think something like that would be necessarily imagined, and I have not come across that kind of mention in any other sources. So anyhow, I think that is a very poignant tale. I have seen it reused in some of the literature, and if you think about a commander who is so committed to the success of his, it reminds me of, I don't know, Admiral Nelson, for example, or some other, at the Borodino fight, I don't know how many of you are famous with it, when Bagration, who was one of the Russian commanders, when he got hit with a flying cannonball, basically demanded to get back up and basically died as a result of that. It's when a commander is so committed to the success of the operation that their own well-being becomes secondary to overseeing and making sure that their military succeeds. Not always the best decision, but if you know you're already dead and if you can boost the morale of your troops in the process, kudos to you, in my opinion.
Could have been done by a subordinate as well.
Well, they did it to each other. For what instance, the subordinate propped him, they propped each other up. That's the way the story is. So anyway, that's how that particular battle ended. And I think we're kind of over time here. So that's just pretty much everything I wanted to say about the Battle of Marathon. Of course, I'm not a military history expert. I've looked at every possible reconstruction I could find. And this is the story, the version that seems to be most plausible. When we get past the entire, stories of both Greco Persian wars, there's kind of a weird conspiracy theory that I put together that I'm not entirely sure is valid, and I cannot find any sources to really justify, but there's snippets from different sources here and there where you can kind of piece that story together. And if that story is true, it would explain a lot about the two major defeats that the Persians suffered in these two wars, and that is Marathon and Plataea. But that's everything I have for the moment. Does anybody else have anything else?
Is it possible? I was thinking that when I saw the cavalry up by the spring and the people on the beach, of course, they had limited mobility between the swamp and the ocean,
right?
So they weren't able to move. But I'm starting to think that they cannibalized their cavalry and started to use them to ferry water back down to the people on the beach. So in essence, their cavalry was no longer cavalry.
Well,
I don't know if I mentioned that or not.
There's a reference to the fact that it was actually loaded on the ships and taken somewhere else. I just brought up this pretty picture of Greek lights and to show you kind of what I was talking about, to where the last person did not have anybody to cover him. And then a couple more maps that I intended to show and I failed. So this is another map of the same sort of arrangement, to where you have the Great March here. Here's the cavalry. Here's the infantry. This is how they think that one of the reconstructions of how possibly the battle, because the Greeks were hanging out in the grove of Hercules originally, because they were thinking about using those trees potentially as a way to block the cavalry attack. But once the cavalry went away and they were left with the infantry, and the Persian camp was right there behind them. That was, and right here you see where you had the Plataeans on one side, you had the Athenians on the other side, and then you had the Athenian rings that are very thin right here. And so what happened is when they went up, because whatever was left, whatever little light cavalry was left after the main cavalry people departed, when they came at a run at these people, of course, this overwhelming numbers broke through the thin ranks to where the thicker flanks managed to overrun these guys. I mean, there's multiple reconstructions. There's some reconstructions that are downright stupid. There's some reconstructions, there's some major military reconstructions that are very, to me, convincing. But I think that something happened there that had to do, I think the Greeks possibly made a mistake by putting their fleet where they did, and it was just one of those draws of the straws, which is one of those rolls of the dice things. And then I just go ahead.
One last thing. Just point out, this is probably one of the most studied ancient battles there is. And there are so many questions. Often we just don't know. We can guess, we can theorize. What they call strategic geography might have argued that they were parallel to the sea,
and it's possible
that's the other major theory.
Right.
But that I just want to make that point. We're not presenting this as gospel.
Definitely not. I mean, this is just one reconstruction. This is just, by the way, this is another very central reconstruction of the perpendicular version. So this shows when the white arrows are the Athenians, and the white arrows pointing back is where the Athenians ran, was in the thin center. And so the elite forces of the Persians partially chased them here, and over here, the Persians were pushed back by the overwhelming Athenian forces. And I think that the issue was this narrow gap to try to get to the fleet. I mean, the Persians elite who chased after the Athenians, they were stuck over here by the swamp and this area. And then the Persians who tried to run back to the ships, they wound up just going straight into the marsh because you had a very narrow, and there possibly was a stampede there. And that's another very likely possibility. And this is just a picture of one of the representations of those two warriors who propped each other up at that last battle. At that battle of Marathon, when they already knew that they were dead. This is believed to be a representation of those two. But yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty much it for today. And I think after this, we can go into the next step of the campaign. By the way, I really like the real names of the Persian leaders, and it really drives me nuts that their names have been so crippled and kind of twisted, first by the Greeks and then by everybody else, and now finally by the English language. I mean, Darius, whom we call Darius, his real name was Darius, which is a proper normal Persian name. And the next character who is about to come onto the scene, the shining, beautiful, magnificent, charming prince, soon to be ruler of all of Persia, that we know as Xerxes, who has been portrayed horrifically in the movie 300, just ridiculously, pathetically, no offense to anyone. Because, yeah, I mean, Darius was really, he's the Prince Charming, he's the golden boy, he's the much beloved heir, spoiled and reared and with delight and all the care, educated in 20,000 ways, was the best priestesses of the Babylonian temples of love, attending to his every need so that the boy can learn how to properly please a woman, that kind of prince who has really, and that's the problem we see over and over again when we have a brilliant ruler who has had to fight for his place, and then his next heir, the next one after him, his heir is usually kind of not quite up to par. Well, Xerxes is about to come to power very shortly. It was Hyriash the Magnificent, and that's our next lovely Persian leader that is about to come on the scene.
But he still was black and had his
and was more diverse. No, and again, Artemisia did not get raped by anyone when she was a child. She was a very spoiled girl, and no, she never slept with any Greek commanders. And there were no rhinoceri. Seriously, No, I'm so sorry.
In Europe.
No. Maybe some centaurs, just no rhinoceros at the time. I'm terribly sorry.
Can I just add one more thing to
this
battle of Marathon? I think one thing that should not be underestimated is the show of force. There's oftentimes, especially in modern warfare, where we'll have an outnumbered group of American forces or allied forces, and they'll be outflanked and outnumbered. But when we provide a show of force, even if we've got aircraft that have less, if they don't have any munitions left, or if they don't have enough gas to remain on site for a certain amount of time, they'll just fly overhead and do what we call a show of force. And I think that when the Greeks did something so uncharacteristic, so unpredictable, like running toward the battlefield when they know that they're outnumbered, I think that does something to the morale and the expectation of the adversary, because it's a show of force. And then when you see on either side of you, if you're in the middle and you see on either side of you that your peers are getting routed by the Greeks, and you're wondering what's ahead of you, I think that the roar of the Greeks, in their battle cry, and then running toward the battle line, and then you see on either side of you, I think that has a detrimental effect, a tremendous detrimental effect on morale. And that's why I asked who the commander was of the Persians. I'm not familiar with who that individual is, but if that's a naval commander, not a ground commander, that also plays a big role, because if you're not really used to ground battle, especially on a level playing field where you really don't know how deep those Greek ranks could be, because you're not above looking down, you don't know how deep those ranks go. I think all of that plays into the psychology of that battle, and would result in the middle ranks of, because you're outflanked, so whatever's left in the middle is going to flee to the ships before the Greeks have a chance to pinch them in.
Yep.
That's what I think.
No, I think that's why I kind of really wanted you in on this, because that gives a great perspective. Though I suppose I've said before, and I'll say again, I blame the Persian loss on one thing and one thing only: Persians can't swim. And that's pretty much the end total result of the war. All right, everyone. Well, thank you very much. And I guess I'm going to say bye to everyone. Okay, thanks for joining. Bye.
Thank you. Everybody be well.
Bye, Ryan.
Later, Ron.
Bye.
Both cast our shadows as our legends unfold. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes.